Beneath the quiet stillness of the Appalachian hills lies a story that was never meant to reach the surface. The air is heavy here, weighed down by the silence of generations who carried their secrets to the grave. But not all secrets stay buried. Some bleed through the soil, staining the memory of the land itself. Imagine, if you will, a family so entangled in its own bloodline that fathers and sons became rivals for the same bride. Not metaphorically, literally. 2 generations bound to one woman, not by love, not by choice, but by the crushing grip of isolation and a hunger to keep the family whole, no matter the cost. This is not a folktale. This is not a rumor whispered at the edge of town. This is a record, pieced together from the fragments the family could not hide, a bed shared across time, across generations, creating a lineage that would never escape the prison of its own making. What follows is not for the faint of heart. This is the story of the most inbred bed alive. To understand how such a nightmare could unfold, we must first strip away the modern world and step into the past. Appalachia was never a forgiving place. The mountains isolated its people, cutting them off from the rest of America, and in that silence, families learned to turn inward. Strangers rarely came knocking, and when they didn't stay. Life was survival, and survival meant clinging to what you had, sometimes at any cost. Blood was the only currency, the only tie strong enough to hold families together when the world outside seemed determined to forget them. In this forgotten corner, a cycle began. A cycle that blurred the line between father and son, husband and heir, until one woman found herself trapped in a union that spanned not just 1 generation, but 2. She became the shared bride of both a man and his son, and from that bed was born not just children, but a living symbol of generational collapse. This was not the kind of scandal that townsfolk whispered about in church pews. It was worse than scandal. It was silence. The silence of neighbors who turned their heads, of family members who chose not to see, the silence of a land that swallowed the screams and gave back nothing but an echo. And in that silence the truth grew twisted, hidden in plain sight, until only the faces of the children told the story their parents could not speak. The woman at the center of this story was not born into choice. Like so many before her, she was raised in poverty, taught that survival meant obedience, and conditioned by silence to accept what was given rather than dream of what might have been. To understand her fate, you must imagine a life where the outside world is nothing more than a rumor, a radio voice that never reaches your hollow, a road too far to walk, a promise you can never cash. Her name has been erased by time, perhaps deliberately, as if even the family understood that speaking it aloud would bind her forever to their shame. But what we know is this: she entered the family through one man, and she remained through another. At first, she was the wife of the father. Older, hardened and controlling, he saw her not as a partner, but as property. The house itself bore witness to the union, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of generations that had lived and died inside without ever leaving. To him, she was another possession, like the land, like the cattle, like the children. But when the son grew into a man, the lines blurred. The boy who should have been her stepson became her second husband. The bed where she once laid with the father became the same bed she was made to share with the son. This was not a decision of romance or rebellion. It was the inevitable gravity of a family that fed upon itself. Her life became a mirror of entrapment, each day folding into the next with no escape. To outsiders, if any ever wandered close enough, she appeared as nothing more than a weary Appalachian wife, but inside the walls of that home, she carried the unbearable weight of 2 generations pressing down upon her, demanding her silence, demanding her body, demanding her compliance. And she gave them children, children who carried the double mark of inheritance. They bore the faces of both father and brother, grandfather and sibling, blurred together until identity itself became a shadow. This arrangement was never spoken of as unusual within those walls. It was survival, they told themselves, a way to keep the land, the name, the blood intact. Yet beneath the surface, cracks formed. The children carried whispers in their very bones. They wore the evidence of their conception on their faces, slight deformities, vacant stares, strange patterns of speech. They were the proof the family tried to bury, but could never quite erase, and so the curse was carried forward, generation after generation, with the woman trapped at its center like an insect in amber, her suffering preserved in silence. In time, the story of this family stopped belonging only to them. The land itself seemed to carry it, as if the soil had been poisoned by what unfolded within those walls. Neighbors, scarce as they were, began to notice the children first. Children who struggled to learn even the simplest words, whose eyes didn't quite meet yours, whose bodies carried small but undeniable marks of their parentage. A slant of the forehead, a twist of the mouth, fingers too short, limbs too thin, skin too pale. At first, people told themselves it was just bad luck, a sickness of the hills, something you couldn't quite name. But behind closed doors, whispers began. They knew. They always knew. Yet no one intervened. That is the cruelest truth of all. Isolation became complicity. The family's strangeness was explained away with shrugs, with mutters of, "That's just how they are," as though deformity and confusion could be inherited without cause. But the truth was right there. Every child was a reflection of the bed their mother had been forced to share. A haunting reminder that the bloodline was folding in on itself, collapsing like a house with rotten beams. And still, the silence persisted. The father who had once claimed the woman as his wife grew older. His authority slipped, his body weakened, but his presence remained like a ghost in the home, haunting the son who had taken his place. Imagine the son lying in the same bed where he was conceived, lying with the same woman his father had once called his own. Each night must have been a reckoning, though none dared to name it. For the son there was no path out, no world beyond those mountains that could erase what had been done. And for the woman, the nightmare had only shifted faces. The walls had not changed, the isolation had not lifted. She was bound to the same prison, only with a new jailer. Children born of this second union bore not just the mark of incest, but the double weight of legacy. They were children of a father and of a brother, of a husband and a son. Their existence was a living contradiction, one that blurred all sense of where one generation ended and another began. In their eyes, you could see the fracture of time itself, a history repeating endlessly within a single family, until the difference between past and present no longer mattered. There is a cruelty in memory because what the body tries to forget, the blood remembers. In this family, memory was etched into the very bones of the children who walked out of that house. They did not need words to tell their story. Their faces spoke for them. And yet, the silence remained louder than any confession. What happens to a family when it devours itself? What happens when blood is no longer sacred, but a trap? The answer lies in these children who bore the burden of choices that were never theirs to make. They were outcasts, even among their own kin. Though they shared the family name, that name became a mark of shame. In schoolhouses, when they even attended, they were set apart, whispered about, mocked for their strange appearances and slow manner of speech. Teachers noted their struggles in hushed tones, but rarely acted. Neighbors kept their distance, too polite or too afraid to say aloud what they all saw. And so, the children lived as shadows, present but never fully part of the world beyond their home. The woman, now older, carried these burdens in silence. Her face became a map of suffering, each line carved deeper with the weight of what had been done to her. Yet, she endured. Perhaps she believed there was no other way. Perhaps in some terrible fashion she convinced herself this was the natural order, for when you are cut off from the outside world, the boundaries of right and wrong blur until survival alone feels like justification. She raised children who were both her offspring and her curse, children who were tied to her by a chain she never had the strength to break. And the son, now the patriarch in his father's shadow, carried his own torment. He had inherited not just the land, not just the burden of keeping the family intact, but the stain of his father's choices. He was both victim and perpetrator, both son and husband. His life whirled, as one long echo of the bed he had been born into. He passed the same curse to his children because there was nowhere else to turn, no one else to bring into the fold. Blood was all they had, and blood was all they would ever take. The cycle tightened like a noose. With each passing year, the family drew further inward, less capable of reaching beyond themselves. Their story was not progress, but collapse, an implosion of lineage, where each generation became a dimmer reflection of the one before it. A house where time did not move forward but circled endlessly, trapping everyone inside. There comes a moment in every hidden history when silence begins to fracture. For this family, it was not sudden. It was slow, like rot creeping up a beam until the structure groans beneath its own weight. Outsiders began to notice the strange uniformity of the children, their sameness. The boys and girls carried the same sunken cheeks, the same heavy foreheads, the same vacant eyes that seemed to stare through rather than at you. Generations of folded blood had carved their marks into the flesh, making it impossible to pretend that nothing was wrong. But still, there were no accusations, no rescues. Appalachia was a land of looking the other way. Poverty made everyone guilty in their own ways, and pointing fingers was dangerous in a place where survival meant minding your own. So the family continued, unchallenged, their home sinking deeper into secrecy as the years passed. What outsiders didn't see was the psychological horror inside. Imagine the mother sitting at the table with her children, some calling her mother, others calling her grandmother, though they were all birthed from the same womb. Imagine her eyes as she looked at them, knowing each face was both her salvation and her punishment. The son, now fully entrenched as the patriarch, began to resemble his father in more than just the lines of his face. His voice, his mannerisms, even his cruelty echoed the man who had once shared his wife. It was as though the father had never truly left, but instead lived on through the son, haunting the house not as a ghost, but as an inheritance of flesh. This is the darkest truth of generational incest. It is not only the body that carries the mark, but the mind. Abuse becomes tradition, and tradition becomes identity. It is here that I must pause and speak to you directly. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Stories like this are buried for a reason, because they force us to confront what we'd rather deny about human nature. So I ask you, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run, even if running meant dying alone in the hills? Or would you stay, shackled by family, because leaving was more frightening than the horror you already knew? Tell me in the comments, because silence, as this family shows us, is the soil in which curses grow. The deeper we follow this family's story, the more it feels less like history and more like a curse etched into the marrow of their bones. By the third generation, the distinctions between father, son, brother, and uncle had nearly dissolved. Children born from the same woman could claim one man as both their father and their grandfather, another as both their brother and their uncle. The web of bloodlines became so entangled that even the family themselves could no longer keep track of who belonged to whom. In this confusion, identity collapsed. A child could not tell where their lineage began or ended, because it didn't. It circled endlessly, folding back upon itself, producing lives that were both continuation and echo, never entirely new. The physical marks deepened with each passing generation. Locals recalled the family by the faces of their children, whose features seemed carved from the same hand. Flattened bridges of the nose, misaligned jaws, eyes that wandered in different directions, and speech that came slow, thick, and halting. The world around them advanced, but inside that hollow, time felt frozen. Radios crackled with voices of presidents and wars fought overseas, but inside that cabin, the conversations never changed. They were about crops, about weather, about survival, never about escape. Escape was not a word that belonged to them. And yet, escape lingered like a ghost. Every now and then, a child would wander to the edge of the woods, staring down the road that led out of the hills, only to turn back. Perhaps fear pulled them home. Perhaps loyalty, perhaps the crushing reality that no matter how far they walked, they carried the mark of their family in their face, in their blood. They were branded by history itself, and there is no outrunning blood. The woman who had been both bride and prisoner eventually faded into old age, her body worn, her spirit hollowed. But she did not leave peace behind. Instead, she left a legacy that bound her descendants tighter than chains. Her suffering was not buried with her. It breathed through every child who bore her likeness. The bed she once shared did not die with her either. It lived on, passed down, not as furniture but as inheritance. An idea, a curse, a wound. By the time the last whispers of this family reached the outside world, their story no longer resembled the story of a family at all. It resembled the story of a collapse. What began as an attempt to preserve blood, to hold land, to cling to survival, had become the undoing of every soul tied to it. Their cabin, once a shelter, now stood as a monument to entrapment, its wooden beams soaked in decades of silence and shame. Those who dared step close swore the air itself felt heavier, as though the house remembered every secret it had ever been forced to contain. Generations of children grew into adults who could never quite leave the shadow of their origin. Some remained in the hills, living lives of half-existence, their world bounded by ridges and silence. Others tried to leave, drifting into nearby towns, but even there they were marked. Their faces told their story before their words ever could. People stared too long, or not at all. Doors closed, jobs were denied. They became living relics of a truth too disturbing for polite society to acknowledge. And yet, this family still exists, in fragments, in bloodlines that carry forward even today. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten hollow or in the face of a stranger on a quiet street, the mark of that union between father, son, and shared bride still lingers, because blood does not forget. It carries memory forward, no matter how desperately we try to bury it. That is the horror of stories like this. They do not end. They ripple outward across time, across generations, until the past feels uncomfortably close to the present. When we speak of Appalachia, we often romanticize the rugged beauty of its hills, the resilience of its people, but buried beneath that beauty are truths that terrify. Families consumed by their own silence, generations trapped by bloodlines they could not escape. And in this particular story, on a woman, 2 generations of men, and the children who bore their mark, we find not just a history, but a warning. Isolation breeds silence, silence breeds secrets, and secrets, when left to fester, consume everything they touch. You have now walked through the shadows of a house that was never meant to be opened, a history that was never meant to be told. Remember this as you leave. The most disturbing horrors are not born of monsters or myths, but of families, of blood, of choices made in silence. And sometimes those choices never die. They live on, in the most inbred bed alive,